From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris coming to you live and direct on this Thursday from the studios here at the News Channel 5 Network. We've got a good show on tap for you this morning. Have you noticed of late here in Middle Tennessee and frankly all around the country, but especially here in Tennessee, so many people moving here, so many people looking to buy, so many people renting, and there are a lot of issues. You have investors coming in from outside the area, buying up perhaps apartment complexes, choosing then to renovate them and maybe fix them up to rent them out at much higher dollars. What happens to the tenants who live there? What are tenants' rights? What are landlords' rights? There are legal protections on both sides of that, and it's something I think a lot of people these days are needing to consider, and it certainly helps if you know what your rights are. We've done stories on this. We've done it focusing on various different apartment complexes where the residents there are kind of wondering, what's going to happen? Where am I going to live? We're going to talk about that this morning, get a chance for you to get a handle on what your legal rights are from whichever side of the issue you're with. And you can call in too. With our guest this morning joining us by Zoom, Zac Oswald. Good morning to you, Zac. You are a lawyer, right?
I am fully invested in the law.
Okay, well, that's a good way to be. And with a focus to some degree on housing practices and the laws as it relates to landlords and tenants?
That's correct. The main focus of my work is on homelessness prevention, and so I do a lot of work preventing foreclosures and evictions.
Okay. Well, and like I said, you heard my opening here. It kind of ties right in on what we're going to talk about this morning. If you would, maybe from your perspective, give me what you see happening in this renters, this landlord, this market that we have for housing here in Middle Tennessee, and some of the problems that are cropping up, especially for folks who maybe then end up finding themselves homeless. What leads to that? How do you view the marketplace right now?
Yeah, we kind of see what's happening as a trickle-down effect. The housing market for people who are trying to invest in home ownership is getting really tight because the market is increasing the rates for those homes. And so what that's doing is it's pushing out the middle class who normally would become homeowners, so they are staying within the renter market. So that's increasing the demand for renter properties,
sure.
And without an increase of supply. So the demand goes up. That means the price for renting an apartment goes up, and that's pushing out the middle and lower class renters at this point, and just increasing basically the struggle of being able to find a place to live for everyone.
Exactly. You know, when we talk about these kind of things, I always think about the idea of, and Manhattan is the example of this, rent control. You know, something like this. There were caps. I don't know if the law has changed there in New York, but, you know, the idea of where the landlord can only raise so much every year. Now, we don't have something like that here in Tennessee, do we? I mean, and is that something you think down the road might be considered?
So it's interesting. In Tennessee, we actually have a law that strictly forbids rent control. So even if a city like Nashville wanted to take on rent control to try and deal with the affordable housing crisis that we're dealing with, the state law prohibits that. So it's actually quite the opposite of New York City and Manhattan, is that even if Nashville wanted to do that in these crazy times, they would be forbidden from doing so.
So the rule of thumb here in Tennessee, which doesn't surprise me with, you know, the legislature we have, it's basically the market will be driven by supply and demand. And again, in large measure, that is the American way, Zac, but again, the concern, I think, is for some of these folks who all of a sudden are going to find themselves with no place to live. I can give you an example. I did a story a couple of weeks ago about an apartment complex in Murfreesboro that actually, you know, catered to a lot of veterans, injured veterans who had come out and they were making their way. They weren't at the VA anymore. And this complex has been purchased by some out-of-state investor. It was a modest apartment complex, but it was nice. But this investor now has bought it, legally so, And he has now given all the residents there who are on fixed incomes and are disabled veterans eviction notices saying you've got to be out by no later than August. And what the plan will be is they're going to come in and they are going to renovate that entire complex, increase it into a luxury apartment type facility, and then start renting them out for much higher amounts of money. And again, that's the American way, right? But what happens to these veterans?
Yeah, that story is not atypical in Nashville right now. We're really seeing apartment complexes getting flipped, basically the same way you would see on an HGTV show, where somebody's coming in, they're renovating the property, and they're doubling the rent. What's unfortunate about that is because there's a lack of affordable housing, there's nowhere else for those people to go. And even the organizations who want to invest in affordable housing at this point, because of the price of land and because of the price of property, they're even getting pushed out of the market because they can't reasonably afford to provide low-income housing because they can't even cover their budget at that point.
You know, I sympathize with that completely. I know there are individuals out there, especially some of them that are doing the investments, that will say, well, look, you know, it is supply, demand, it's the marketplace. If you can't afford to live here, then you just have to move somewhere else. Too bad. I mean, I've heard that come out of people's mouths. I've got some thoughts on that, but I mean, what do you say to that kind of approach? It's kind of like, well, look, all right, well, you no longer can live here. You know, you can't afford the place anymore. I guess you just have to move. I mean, are there legal protections for people like that?
So for the tenants who are living in properties that are getting flipped like this, what I would explain to them beforehand is, you know, you always want to have a term lease in place if you can that says, hey, I as the renter can stay here until July of 2023. When you start getting into these situations where the landlord doesn't renew the lease, what your lease turns into is basically a month-to-month rentership. And you just want to be careful at that point because either the landlord or the tenant can terminate the lease at that point with just 30 days notice that goes around the rental period. And so the most important thing I can tell renters at that point is to keep their head on a swivel, make sure that they're paying attention to what their rights are, when their lease could or could not end, so that they can protect themselves, because there's nothing outside of that just says, hey, I get to stay in this place for the rest of my life.
You know what's one curious thing about this, and again, I understand sometimes the plight of the landlords as well as the tenants, but one of those tenants I talked to at that facility in Murfreesboro, okay, they were told that they have their lease, it runs through August or November, and they've been told now it's not going to be renewed, you have to be out, okay? So they're in the process of looking, but if someone finds, say, a new apartment that's affordable that they think they can get, okay, in July, the landlord's not letting them out early of the lease. And you know what that is? That's crap, and that landlord's a bad person. That's my take. What do you think of that? Do you have any legal recourse? Hey, you got to get out of here in November. You struggle, you finally find yourself a place to live, maybe, and so you got to get out of your lease a couple months early because they're kicking you out, but they say no, you have to stay, which means you lose the chance to rent this apartment that you found that obviously is very difficult to locate. What do you think of crap? And that's exactly what it is, like that.
Well, let me say this, Nick. I'm not going to argue with your phrasing of that. I'm going to let that stand where it is, and definitely not pit against you on that. What I would say to the landlords at that point is, if you've got a goal for this property and the tenants moving out is going to allow you to accomplish that goal, why are we complicating things? It's really similar with a landlord who is trying to evict somebody or just wants to kick them out, but then they file an eviction against that tenant, and now the tenant's out there trying to find another place to live, but they've got this eviction on their record because they couldn't move out in time. That's going to hinder the tenant's ability to go find another place, and it's going to force them to struggle to stay in the only home that they have. And so it's just that the ends are not justifying the means in those situations, and we've all got to work together. Capitalism is here to stay in America, but we've got to use some common sense and a little bit of altruism if we can to make this work for everybody.
All right, Zac Oswald's with us from the Legal Aid Society. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll get more specifics into exactly what people's legal rights are when it comes to where they live, how long they can stay, whether you have a chance to appeal. I know there's some new laws on the books. We'll get into more of that. We can take some phone calls from you as well if you'd like to join us, 737-7587. Back more with Zac right after this.